Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, the Chronicles of Bigfoot, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening. So much love to each and every one of you, and go and spoil yourself. Go and get yourself an effervescent sparkling drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, this is part 2 of our story, so if you haven't heard part 1, go back, click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the whole story. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. 3 months later, I was soon to learn that at 10 years old, your choices are commandeered and expropriated from you by well-meaning adults who emphatically believe they have your best interests at heart. But do they really? I was contented, very secure living in Ireland with both of my grandparents. My life on the Emerald Isle was all I'd ever known. Now I was going to live on a strange Montana farm in the Americas. In truth, the idea held about as much appeal for me as eating my Brussels sprouts at Christmas. Believe me, I hated Brussels sprouts. From what I'd heard, America was so huge, a diverse country, that by contrast to a small island situated on the westernmost edge of Europe, it seemed so gargantuan by contrast. And for little old me, the prospect of such a fortuitous move was more than a little overwhelming. In truth, I've always preferred small, intimate places, not huge, sprawling, never-ending spaces where you could potentially get so hopelessly lost. By all accounts, the mere thought of being thousands of miles away from my grandparents brought on a morbid attack of the blues. "Sweetheart," my grandmother had said, as she began packing my clothes in a large suitcase for me, "if you're really unhappy living in Montana, just speak to Shannon about it. Tell her exactly how you're feeling, and I'm sure she'll send you straight back to Ireland. At the end of the day, your mother cares about your happiness above anything else in the world. If she sees you're desperately unhappy, she'll send you back home to us. I'm sure of it." I think what your grandmother is trying to say is that you need to give Montana a chance. You should live there for a few months before you make any rash decisions. I remember when I first brought Eartha, our big fat tabby, to this house. You were scared of her in the very beginning. You were so certain she was going to scratch you with those sharp claws of hers. But she didn't, did she? And now you love Eartha to death and wouldn't like to be without her. It's no different going to America. It may seem very scary, very intimidating in the beginning, but my bet is you'll love it there. I mean, think about all the people who emigrated there during the potato famine. If it was so terrible living there, don't you think they would have returned when things were better? But they didn't. They stayed put. They laid down roots. "Look at this," said my grandfather. "This was written by a woman in the Irish potato famine, who felt just as you do. I think we all relate to what she wrote about." My grandfather opened the old book and read me a passage from it. "My stomach aches with hunger. If I didn't know it was starvation I was suffering from, I would surely believe it was a deadly, wasting cancer that was cannibalizing my entire body. I'm watching myself withering away like a flower in a vase that is past its very best. Who knew hunger could cause you so much physical pain? But it does. My stomach gnaws at night, keeping me from sleep. I feel as if I'm being eaten alive by rats from the inside, and every part of me aches and groans. I'm only 22 years old, but I feel as if I'm going on 85, for my body has become feeble, weak, very frail, and everything I do is a monumental effort. I'm not even sure if I will make the trip to America, but she is my only beacon of light in these stormy, tempestuous seas. I hope she can be my refuge. I really do. But only time will be able to tell. So many of us are prepared to take the risk of embracing a whole new life, away from what we've ever known. We have nothing to lose, for there is nothing left for us here, only a certain death, which I do not want to embrace." So there you are. You see, this woman's only hope was to go to America. It couldn't have been easy for her. but she made it, and I gather procured a fabulous life for herself. And so can you, Dotty. I'm quite sure about that. I remember on the flight to America, I was escorted onto the plane by an air hostess who kept constant vigil over me. I will admit I was desperately nervous about flying when the plane took off into the sky, but I was still intrigued about the journey that lay ahead of me. It was when I arrived at the Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport that I began to feel twitchy and nervous. I knew I was in a different country. You could feel it as clearly as the wind blowing against your face. The different American accents that filtered in the atmosphere did not carry the ring of the Irish accents of home that I knew so well. The kindly air hostess collected my suitcase, put it on the trolley, and we glided through customs where her eyes scanned the people, who all had signs raised up above their heads. They were waiting for the exiting passengers, one of them that was clearly me. "Oh, there you are," said the air hostess, rolling the trolley over to a man who had a sign with my name on it that read Dotty Hennington. "You'll go with this nice man," she told me. "It's been lovely to meet you, Dotty Hennington, and welcome to America. I'm quite sure you're going to love it here." "Thank you so much," I said. "Thank you for looking after me during the trip." "It's only a pleasure, Dotty. Have a lovely trip, won't you?" My legs had wobbled unsteadily. I hesitantly climbed into the taxi. I would be taking a 3.5-hour drive to my mother's farmhouse in Montana. Who knew a taxi drive could be this long? But I'm glad to say we frequently made stops on the trip for refreshment breaks, and the taxi driver was very kind to me. He seemed to appreciate that for a 10-year-old girl from the Emerald Isle, America seemed like a humongous place that could quite literally swallow me whole, given half a chance. "So what do you think of America?" he asked me, as I stared out of the window, as we drove through the rich rolling countryside. The man had a gentle southern drawl. I think the only words that came out of my mouth at the time were, "It's so big." In truth, the vast open spaces suddenly made me feel tiny, really tiny. I remember gawking at the countryside. America was a whole other world, one so remarkably different to the one I'd left behind. I couldn't help thinking of the immigrants from the potato famine arriving here for the very first time. Did they feel as intimidated as I did right now? I'm sure they must have, I promptly decided. "It's big all right, young lady, and you're not alone thinking that. Every time I pick up tourists from small countries like Ireland and England, it's the first thing they always say to me. It's so big. Everyone finds the wide open spaces more than a little daunting." "Don't you sometimes worry that you'll get hopelessly lost? I mean, scared even? It must be so easy to lose your way out here." "You know, young lady, that's a very good question that you ask. When a place is so big like this, it is very, very overwhelming. But I promise you, you do get used to it. After a while, you won't even think it's big at all. It's a question of perception." I was not convinced I could ever get used to such a huge, humongous place. But despite how intimidating it was, there was no doubt America was magnificently beautiful. But would I like it here? That was the quintessential question. And in truth, I didn't know the answer to it. I was already feeling dreadfully homesick, missing my grandparents and my big fat tabby Eartha. 1.5 months later. My grandfather had been absolutely right about giving my new life in America time to settle. Like mud in a glass jar that finally sinks to the bottom, so that the water above becomes very clear. It hadn't been easy saying goodbye to my grandparents, who had been wrought with pain to see me go. I'd never seen my grandfather cry before, but he couldn't help it. Tears seemed to roll down his cheeks, which he hurriedly wiped away with his thumbs. But there was never any fooling me. I'd seen those tears. There was something that felt so final about that goodbye. It was soul-destroying, gut-wrenching. I remember he hugged me so tightly, as if he was desperately afraid of ever letting me go. I hated goodbyes. "Don't be sad," Pops I'd said to him. "Forgive me, sweetheart. Look at me. I don't know what's come over me. I've got all over emotional. I'm just very sad to see you go.
But you'll be back for a holiday, I'm sure, any time soon."
He said the last part of the sentence as if it was an impediment to actually believe, as America seemed far, far away. Let's just say in those days travelling by plane was not as common or unremarkable as it is now, and so lugubrious goodbyes always seemed to leave behind that bitter aftertaste that you could never fully expunge. I know in my heart an ominous sinking feeling consumed my focus. I would secretly wonder if I was ever going to come back to Ireland again. For a young 10-year-old girl, it was a personal Armageddon-like experience, when your life as you know it is turned upside down and torn wide apart. But there was nothing I could do but to acquiesce to wherever the journey would ultimately take me. Let's just say my mother Shannon and her husband Seamus made me feel incredibly welcome in their very charming Montana farmhouse. So I settled in pretty seamlessly. I could see why my mother had fallen for Seamus, even as a 10-year-old girl. He was big, ruggedly handsome, with a gentle southern drawl that I found quite heartwarming, and he was desperately kind to me. I would have fallen for him myself if I'd been my mother's age. He was like a great big cuddly teddy bear that you couldn't help but like, and he had both his eyes and both his ears were intact, unlike my own teddy bear. The house itself was worlds away from our poetic-looking farmhouse in Ireland, with its less than straight stone walls and imperfect charm. The house was symmetrical, with no joint or hinge out of place. It had wooden panelled walls, wide plank floors, exposed wooden beams, huge open fireplaces, and simple open floor plans. The house was made from wood, built on 2 levels, with wide windows, a grey slate roof and walls painted in a pale peach colour, with a large wraparound porch that hugged the house, supported by slender columns. It was nestled cosily in the heart of a verdant valley, luxuriating under the shade of 2 huge oak trees, with sculptural boughs that seemed to be saluting anyone approaching the house, like 2 great big Grand Army generals. I was to learn that the property had been in Seamus's family line for many generations, and had been divided between him and his older brother Marvin, who was 15 years his senior. Let's just say after his parents retired, the land had been divided theoretically on legal documents between the 2 of them, but physically there was no dividing line between the 2 properties, just a verbal understanding between both men. Even though Seamus's brother Marvin lived in a farmhouse on exactly the same land, it would seem that he and his 2 kids, Finn 12 and Liam 10, who were both my cousins, were very much woven up in the daily, everyday fabric of our lives, like a tight tapestry. In truth, we were like an extended family, living under 2 different roofs on acres and acres of property. Of course, it had been an emotional reunion between me and my mother, after having realised she was so much more than just my sister. She was the woman that carried me in her womb, and clandestinely gave birth to me, on a cold, very unforgiving bathroom floor, terrified out of her wits, with my grandmother at the helm, trying to calm down her painful, frantic wails, and my anxious grandfather strutting up and down the passageway, asking my grandmother if everything was all right every few seconds. "I'm sorry I never told you that I was your mother. It wouldn't have been right at the time. You do understand that, Dottie? You understand why I asked Mum and Dad to send you to live with me. You are my daughter, after all. This is where you belong. You were the very reason staying in America was too hard for me. But you're here now with us, and that's all that counts. I'm so glad you've come."
"So am I," said Seamus, embracing me warmly. "You're as good as any daughter to me, Dottie, and any children we may have in the future. Our home feels complete now that you've arrived. Your mother missed you desperately."
Spring the following year. I remember it was early spring. It was magnificently beautiful in Montana. The scenery was breathtaking. The sovereign grandeur of the sculptural mountains that blotted the skyline with their billowing contours and stoic majesty was swathed in lavish sprinklings of white snow. The stone-washed grass had now turned the undulating valleys into a blaze of green, and the panoramic roof of the sky was a cup of crystal blue, with pleasant temperatures of between 50 and 70 degrees. One had to be mindful of the threatening Pacific storms that could so easily unleash their wrath on the environment, like a cantankerous contrary child having a hissy fit, so you might be left with unsettled weather for 3 days at a time. My 12-year-old cousin Finn had managed to persuade my stepfather Seamus and his dad Marvin that we wanted to camp on a remote part of the voluminous uncharted property, never really been explored before by the family, as the rambling land they lived on was boundlessly prodigious, so a great deal of it was like an elusive page in a mysterious book that had not been read yet, so its unrevealed, unmapped script remained steeped in wondrous awe, as not knowing what the page contained was what made it all the more riveting.
"I see," Uncle Marvin had teased. "You want to get as far away from the adults as is possible. Is that it?"
"Something like that," said Finn, flushing, his skin going a rosy shade of pink. He looked rather bashful. "We just don't need the grown-ups breathing down our necks. Kids need space too. Dottie is telling us all the details about the Enid Blyton book she's been reading in Ireland. And those kids, Dad, they had the best adventures in the entire world. The adults were never involved until the famous 5 revealed the secret smugglers to the police or something like that. So they did their own thing, without the parents breathing down their necks all the time. Don't you see?"
"I think I do," said Seamus, rubbing his hand through his hair. "So Dottie here is filling your head with all kinds of ideas, all that have one prerogative, that adults cannot be involved."
He looked at me with a large grin on his face.
"I think you're giving your cousins bright ideas, Dottie, that might just invite trouble. You've brought out the intrepid explorers in them," he teased.
"I try my best," I said. "Sorry, Dad. I know you usually like to come camping with us, but we really do want to go on our own this time. Have an adventure all to ourselves. Is that too hard to understand? We don't mean to be rude, but you were our age once."
"Don't I know it?" said Seamus, giving me a wink.
"Oh, go on, let them go," said my mother. "Let them have a bit of fun, a bit of privacy on their own. You drive them over to a spot they fancy. We'll pick them up in the morning. How about that? They'll be fine, I'm quite sure. Besides, Finn is very responsible, and he knows how to use your rifle if needs must." Seamus gave Finn his rifle. Finn had been taught how to use it from a very young age. My mother had kindly prepared us cold boxes filled with meat, salads and bread rolls for a barbecue. Seamus gathered our camping gear together, and off we went in his truck, driving through some of the flowering meadows in his off-road vehicle, with his 2 golden Labradors in the back, who were barking excitedly and thrashing their tails. They loved any kind of adventure, even if it was just to drop 3 young children off on an uncharted part of the property. The off-road vehicle jolted and juddered over the uneven terrain, and Finn pointed out the area where he'd like us to be dropped off, a part of the property that was unfrequented and unexplored by the family. "Here, Uncle Seamus, this will do very nicely," said Finn. "This place is so cool. I fancy us camping beside the stream over there, on the fringes of that lovely wood grove, overlooking the mountains. This place is brilliant. It's perfect for us. Famous 5, eat your heart out. The invincible 3 have finally arrived."
"You've chosen a perfect spot," said Seamus approvingly. "You're not just a pretty face, Finn. You're very shrewd. This is an excellent location."
Seamus parked his truck, allowing the 2 golden Labradors, Dothman and Viola, to go exploring the terrain. They needed very little encouragement, their tails thumping excitedly as they galloped over the stream, running directly into the woods, barking happily, their noses clearly on a scent trail of a squirrel or a chipmunk. But Seamus knew with one whistle, and his 2 obedient dogs would be back like lightning.
"Do you need a hand setting up camp for the night?"
Seamus had asked, his voice sounding eager. Finn looked offended, his mouth turned downwards into a scowl. "We don't need your help, Dad. We're perfectly capable of putting up our own tent, thank you very much. This is our adventure, not yours."
"Fair enough. I know when I've outstayed my welcome,"
said Seamus, his face unable to hide his disappointment. I could see he'd have loved nothing better than to help us get the tent pitched, as he was a hands-on person who enjoyed getting his hands dirty.
but he realized his services were relegated to being a taxi driver, and he was now surplus to requirements. "Well, I know when I'm not wanted," said Seamus, trying to suppress the spirited boy in him that was begging to come out. "I'll leave you be then, and I'll be here in the morning to pick you up." My heart was fluttering excitedly in my chest, especially when Seamus whistled and the dogs came running through the woodgrove towards him, returning to the vehicle and jumping inside, their tails still thumping enthusiastically. It was clear they didn't want to leave the woodgrove, not with their noses having been privy to some exciting brand new scent signatures that they were not acquainted with. But where Seamus was, they would follow, like the rats in the Pied Piper of Hamilton. Seamus started up his vehicle, driving through some of the grass until he was gone, and it was just the three of us left to enjoy this wide-open space together. Let's just say we welcomed the liberating feeling this treasured moment engendered for us. It felt quite blissfully wonderful to be alone together. Like the Three Musketeers, or as Finn had so eloquently put it, the Three Invincibles. I kind of liked that. The name had a pleasing ring to it. What I loved about both my American cousins is they didn't look on me as a girl, so I felt like a very important part of this team. It was such a fabulous day. The temperatures were pleasingly warm for spring, but not too hot. The stream was magnificent, with crystal clear water that thrashed over the sculptural rocks with a feisty, spirited zestfulness that was almost playful, teasing even. We paddled in the cool water for a while, enjoying the feeling of its ice-coldness on our feet. Soon we decided it was time to set up camp, and Finn and Liam skillfully got the tent erected that was suitable for all three of us, where we could snugly cosy up together, 3 sleeping bags lying together side by side. I went off to gather kindling and firewood. I took a leisurely walk in the woodgrove. Some of the ponderosa pine trees in there were easily over 100 foot tall, along with junipers and limber pines that were not stunted in their growth by any manner of means. The forest smelt exquisite, like honeyed butterscotch mixed with earth and moss. I walked down the woodland trail, with a wicker basket in my hand, collecting the wood. I noticed that owing to the compact nature of the trees that congregated together so tightly, there was only a scattering of light that twinkled through the open canopy. The forest was filled with the pleasant sound of the trilling bird's song. I observed squirrels and chipmunks scampering up trees, looking at me through their wild but inquisitive dark eyes. I scared away some timid-looking deer and caused a few white rabbits to scatter. As I was gathering wood and kindling, I couldn't shake off the ominous feeling that I was not alone. Something or someone was watching me. I was sure of it. I reasoned with myself that in a forest there are probably unseen eyes everywhere, staring at you from obscure angles, like a reticent squirrel or even a forest bird. Who knew what could be watching you? I returned to the camping site heavily laden with my basket of wood, which I stacked in the neat circular fire pit that Liam had so diligently arranged. The prepossessing day was tranquil and calm, like an enveloping warm hug. It was a welcome relief after the rather cold, long-drawn-out winter we'd had. We hung around the stream, drank ice-cold lemonade from our ice boxes. Before long we lit up the fire pit. It began to smoulder. Whispers of white smoke meandered up into the sky. In a trice a crackling fire was burning brightly, snapping, popping and crackling. Finally the sun became fainter and fainter as she finally set over the horizon, smudging the sky in a colour wash of tangerines and burnt amber blush. It was soon graciously overtaken by the smudgy greyness of a pewter sky. Then, as if by a flick of a light switch, darkness was born without any apologies. It seized the sky like a black knight galloping across the ether on his inky stallion. I was pleased to see that the moonlight tonight was magnanimous and congenial, as an almost full moon cast her shimmering light over everything, smiling down upon us. Even the stars in the sky were so bright they looked like polished diamonds. Before long we were happily barbecuing, sticky spare ribs, burgers, chicken kebabs and chicken wings on the grill, which we retrieved from the icebox. The smoky, aromatic, sweet, fruity smells of the sizzling meat wafted through the forest, the ethereal white smoke rising wistfully from our campfire.
Finn took charge of the barbecue, turning the meat around with a long fork. He did a sensational job as chef extraordinaire, and the look and smell of the food was incredibly delicious. Soon our stomachs began to rumble. We sat on our crossed legs with paper plates in our hands, eating our fill with sticky fingers, while being serenaded by the tuneful, cheerful orchestra of frogs and crickets. It didn't get better than this. We watched the flames of the fire dancing merrily over the wood. It was later we sat around the fire roasting marshmallows on long forks that Shannon had skillfully packed, when it was Finn who suggested a ghost story was well in order. "You can't sit by a campfire without telling a good old ghost story," he exclaimed. "Those are the rules." "We'll take it in turns," he said. "See if we can make up a scary ghost story designed to scare. I, for one, want to be scared stiff. I want to go back to my tent tonight, trembling in my boots, scared that the ghoulies are going to get me." "Be careful what you ask for, Finn," I teased. "It might just come true." "As it happens, I don't have to make up a ghost story. I already know one, because I've seen a ghost." "What?" said Finn, his mouth dropping open in astonishment. "Is this a big wind-up? You haven't really seen a ghost, have you, Dotty?" "I have," I said. "It was the weirdest experience of my life. But I know she was a ghost. There was no doubt about it in my mind. Besides, I wasn't the only one that saw her. There were 3 other eyewitnesses, my family." "What happened?" my 2 cousins asked, their round eyes focused on me with a fervent interest. "The weird thing was it was during the day," I told them. "I would never expect to see a ghost in the day. To be fair, it was late afternoon, verging towards the evening. Me and my parents were at the coast, you see. Shannon was there too. I was 8 years old. We were having a late afternoon picnic. The beach was surrounded by these sculptural-looking high cliffs. I was making a sandcastle in the sand. My grandfather was helping me make an impressive fort around the castle. It was a prepossessing afternoon, as seagulls squawked in the sky above us. The spirited waves crashed tempestuously against these high cliffs, and we were seated on this golden pocket of beach sand, which was sandwiched between these masterful high-rise rocks and stunning-looking cliffs that overlooked the rugged coastline and the turquoise waters of the sea. So there I was, patting my upside-down bucket filled with sand with the back of my trowel. I looked up to see this young woman wearing a white dress, running past me bare feet. I remember seeing her face so clearly. She looked directly at me. She looked like she'd been crying. Her cheeks were puffy, her eyes red. For a brief moment her eyes met mine. Then she just seemed to turn away and run. I asked my family who that girl in the white dress was, and no one knew what I was talking about. I was told that there was no girl in a white dress. But there was, I insisted. I saw her. No one took any notice of me. And then Shannon, moments later, pointed out to the top of the cliff. "What's she doing there? A girl in a white dress. What's she doing there?" asked Shannon. We all stared up at the top of the cliff, and we saw the woman in the white dress. It was weird, her dress was blowing in a blustery wind, but there wasn't that much wind on this day. "Oh my God," said Shannon. "What's she going to do? I think she's going to jump." We watched in horror as the woman jumped from the cliff directly to meet her deadly fate. There were jutting rocks piercing through the water to greet her on her dramatic descent. We watched in abject horror as part of the water became crimson. We saw it with our very own eyes, her dead body just floating on the water, bobbing up and down against the waves like a limp rag doll. Then she was gone. My parents naturally went to report the suicide to the police. That was when we learnt that we hadn't actually seen a real woman at all, but her ghost, that had been sighted on numerous occasions by fishermen visiting the area over the years. I was told this young woman was a twin. Her brother had enlisted in the British Air Force as a fighter pilot. You see, Ireland was neutral in the Second World War, but her brother insisted on doing his bit for the greater good of humanity. I gather at the very same time that his plane was shot down by enemy gunfire, this young woman threw herself off a cliff face. I think she might have sensed her brother's ending and couldn't bear to be without him. So they both exited the earth plane tragically at exactly the same time. They say twins have this unfathomable connection where they can feel each other's pain. Wow, that's the saddest story I ever heard, said Finn. And you swear it's true? Ask Shannon if you don't believe me. She saw the girl in white as well. At that time when you saw her, you say you didn't know she was a ghost. No, she looked as real as you or me, I told both my cousins. It was Finn's turn to tell a story, but as he did not know any true ghost stories, he was struggling to make anything up. His story was so ridiculously silly, especially when he put on that scary voice, that me and Liam cracked up laughing.
"Aye, Mr. Barryman, I saw the ghost of the old Tower Bridge."
Finn's face creased with annoyance. How can you laugh at me? I'm trying to scare you. Well, you're not succeeding, I giggled. You're making us laugh. All of a sudden, our attention was immediately diverted, as Finn pointed to this bright blue, curious light in the sky. It was like nothing we'd ever seen before. It was huge and round. For a brief second, it lit up the heavens, and then it began to drop. And a while later, we heard this ear-piercing booming sound that was so loud that the ground beneath us began to vibrate. It was as if something that was in the sky had suddenly fallen and hit the ground so loudly. Me, Finn and Liam stared at each other with rounded eyes. What the hell? Said Finn, grabbing his father's rifle. We followed him with our flashlights, running towards the sound. We ran so fast, like March hares. We were eager to find out what the noise was. We didn't waste our time or energy with wrestling doubts, fears, misgivings and uncertainties that adults might surely entertain. We were impulsive, inquisitive, curious. We wanted to know what the hell was going on. It would seem that listening to ghost stories had done little to subdue or dull our inquiring minds that were ravenously hungry for answers. It was tenebrous as we ventured through the woodgrove, but we were following that large explosion we'd heard, that had enabled the entire ground to quiver, heave and quake. We believed it was somehow connected to that strange blue light. Our sneaker-covered feet crunched the forest debris beneath us, but we weren't trying to be quiet. I had no idea a forest could be so menacing at night. When the darkness steals away all the light, and all that you see is the tall, lofty silhouettes of towering trees with needled boughs jiggling in the wind, all their detail and definition harshly obliterated from them, so that in the end they look more like ominous giants, staring at you with guileful, unfriendly intent. As we got closer to where we'd heard the booming, crashing sound, that was when we saw this blue light flashing between the branches. It was then that me and my cousins judiciously sensed that we needed to be incredibly discreet, as if we were being guided by a greater instinct that warned us to be very careful. We tiptoed towards an area where we could get greater visibility of this strange blue light. What we saw next baffled me. The only way I can describe it was there was a massive sparkling blue glowing rounded diamond on the ground that looked to be the size of a yard shed. It was giving off these prisms of blues, mauves, violets and colours in a spectrum that I've never ever seen before. The light seemed to be alive with an incredible intelligence to it. I'd like to say it looked like some craft from outer space or something, but not so. A better description would be it was like a massive stone or diamond that had landed on the ground. It was solid and dense, but sparkling, giving off this ethereal, illusory light. I had no idea what on earth it was. It was curiously strange, very bizarre. That was when something even weirder and significantly more idiosyncratic happened. We could see 3 ponderous humanoid figures standing up gracefully at about 8 feet tall, covered in hair with human-looking faces. In those days I'd never heard of Bigfoot before, but this is what we were seeing. There were 3 of them. They were absolutely enormous, and they ran towards this light and appeared to be bathing in it like you or I might soak in a bubble bath. The light was so revealing. We could see every detail of these creatures, and their humanness took me off guard. But they were built like giants, covered in long flowing dark hair. The creatures bathed in the light and enjoyed it. And then this big stone thing that had hit the ground so fiercely just lifted up on its own accord into the sky and was gone in just a whisper like that. And that was when we saw the creatures talking excitedly among themselves. I think one of them might have sensed our presence, as several small stones began to be flung in our direction, and in terror we ran through the woods as fast as we could, with these strange creatures running behind us. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, my breathing was fast and furious. Finn was screaming, "Run! For God's sake, run!" I could hear the heavy feet pounding behind us, and once we'd left the forest and returned to the safety of our tents, the creatures that followed us left us well alone. But Finn sat up at the door of the tent all night, clutching his rifle so tightly in his hands that his eyes were round and his face drained of colour.
"What the hell? What was that?"
None of us answered him. We didn't say a word. That's what shock does to you. It can rob you of any speech. In truth, I honestly do not know how we fell asleep that night, but we did. And in the morning I arose to find Finn fast asleep at the door of the tent, with the rifle lying limply by his side.
"What the hell was that blue light last night? And those hairy human giants that were washing themselves in the light? What was it?"
said Finn, trying to rack his brain for answers that we all knew would never be forthcoming.
"Why did those things chase us away? And more to the point, who and what are they? And why are they connected to that blue stone or that strange light, whatever it was?"
It was funny in the light of the morning, when everything is revealed, and nothing ambiguous can slink easily into the dark shadows and hide from your sight. It would seem our confidence was renewed, our curiosity once again provoked. Even though we'd been chased through the woods the previous night by these strange hairy creatures that were clearly trying to get rid of us. We knew if they'd intended to harm us, they'd have easily done so, based on their huge size and their powerful bodies. But they didn't, so we decided to go and check on the spot where we'd seen the shimmering blue stone. And when we reached the location, there was a deep hollow indentation in the ground, and the vegetation in the area was ever so slightly burnt up. And there was a strange lingering smell that reminded us of frankincense. Moments later we heard the sound of Seamus's truck coming to collect us. Before long the 2 golden Labradors had rocketed through the forest to see us, and when they reached us and the strange hollow in the ground, they began to bark at it excitedly.
"What's all the commotion about?"
asked Seamus, who followed the dogs into the woods and was staring at the strange hollow in the ground with bemusement on his face.
"What the heck?"
he said, lowering himself on his knees and examining the small crater in the ground.
"It smells rather peculiar, like frankincense, I think. Let's go. Did you children have an adventure that could rival Enid Blyton's famous 5? Tell me that."
"You bet," said Finn, grinning. "You don't know the half of it, Dad." To cut a long story short, I'm not sure why me and my cousins sat on our story for years and years. I don't even think after Finn got married that he even told his wife, as I never told my husband. Some stories feel like they're meant just not to be told. I'm glad to tell you I made several trips back to the Emerald Isle to see my grandparents again. But all these years later, I now live in Montana with my husband and kids. But this enigmatic experience of mine leaves me with more questions than answers, as it does my cousins. Of course, me and my cousins are in no doubt that the creatures we saw in the woodgrove that night were indeed Bigfoot. But why they wanted us away from that blue stone, God only knows. And what that blue stone was remains a mystery. I'll leave you to speculate about that. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.